What's up, folks? So this is a continuation of a conversation that is just never going to die out, it seems. It's a topic that's been covered extensively both on my channel and pretty much on every other Nintendo channel and gaming channel even. And yes, it is just another video about game key cards, which, for those of you that do not know, are just simple plastic keys that you insert into your console, specifically the Switch 2, and it gives you access into the Nintendo store to be able to download said game and use it on your own device. It's not as simple as the code in the box, which is still an option that third-party developers could use, because the code in the box simply allows you to single download, whereas the game key card allows you to download the title onto any console that you insert that game key card into. But after the game is downloaded, you can only actually play the game with the game key card inserted. So you can download it on multiple Switches, but obviously you need to insert it in the specific console that you're playing on. So it's almost like a physical right to access your digital title. It's confusing, it's controversial, it's convoluted, and it's been that way since way back in the April Direct, where Nintendo spent an ample amount of time really highlighting the difference between the types of cartridges that the Nintendo Switch 2 has, which already creates a massive issue because as far as Nintendo gamers go, specifically in the Nintendo environment, physical sales are much more significant and much more prevalent than some of the competition, like the PlayStation, for example. So this takes the simplest of concepts that Nintendo has always had, where you go and buy a cartridge, put it in your console, and you're able to play the game, and it just makes everything a headache. Now, obviously, over time, this has created a few different discussions and disagreements. And like I said, the whole game keycard situation has been discussed pretty in depth on this channel and many other channels as well, so I'm gonna kind of skip ahead on a lot of the discussion and go with the most recent talking point that's been making the rounds. And that is specifically that third-party developers are now using the speed of the Switch 2's internal SSD versus the cartridges themselves as their justification for using the game keycard as opposed to putting their game entirely on cartridge. The first company to do this and bring attention to the sphere was Ubisoft, where they said that Star Wars Outlaws needed to be on a game keycard because otherwise it wouldn't be able to run as properly as it could off of the Nintendo cartridge, since it's not as fast as the internal SSD of the Switch 2. And now Square Enix is making a very similar claim about one of the upcoming Final Fantasy VII games. Now, where do I begin? So it is important to note that the game keycard versus the actual 64GB cartridge, which is the only option available from the Nintendo Switch 2, is reportedly, according to the number that's being flagged around, $15 to $20 difference. That's an important point to note because obviously it means that a developer puts their game on a game keycard, it costs them less money, so when they sell it to the user, they can either charge less for the game or they get more money in their pocket. So right off the bat, the start of the discussion should be very important to focus on. It's that the game keycard is much cheaper than the official full 64GB cartridge that Nintendo is selling to these third-party devs. And it's a non-insignificant amount as well. So now you have a vast majority of the physical games that are available for the Nintendo Switch 2 being placed on the game keycard. This has caused many people to protest against the third-party developers. They're telling the third-party developers that if you want my money and you want me to spend on these titles, then you have to put the full game on a cartridge. One of the better performing third-party titles early on the Switch's launch was Cyberpunk 2077. And it's no coincidence that that game happened to be fully on cartridge. But outside of that, and from the reports of most third-party developers throughout the short lifespan of the Switch 2 so far, it seems like most third-party companies are extremely disappointed with the performance of their games, and I'm talking strictly on a sales-wise performance. So this puts third-party developers in a little bit of a pickle. Either they risk their game not selling too well by putting it on a game keycard, or they opt to put it on the 64GB cartridge, and either have to increase the price of their game, which would also impact sales, obviously, or take the hit on how much money they would make per copy sold physically. And it's a risk because obviously they can't guarantee sales. Because as it stands over the course of the past 5 years, on a good day, the portion of software sales that were first party were like 75%. So it might not necessarily be worth it for the third-party devs to go out of their way, spend more money on these physical cartridge games in order for them to not nearly sell as well as they like. Basically, they take a smaller risk, they make a bunch of those game keycard titles and hope that to make more money on the digital sales. Because obviously, they're still going to be paying a cut for all of this stuff towards Nintendo. So now, in an attempt to kind of make Nintendo fans accept game keycards, some of these third-party developers have decided to really push the narrative that the Switch 2 itself is much faster than the 64GB cartridge, and that's why they need to put it on the SSD. Like I said, Ubisoft said it a while back, and then most recently Square Enix has been kind of pushing it out to people. In their most recent quote, they said they'd like, if possible, maybe Nintendo fans to understand the keycards and maybe come to accept it as part of the culture of gaming on the Switch because it allows more opportunities. Because, and this is Naoki Hamaguchi saying this, I think perhaps the biggest issue for developers, certainly for people like us who make high-end HD games, is the loading speed. So, just like what Ubisoft said after Star Wars Outlaws came out, basically, you gotta accept that this is going to be the case. Now, the problem is, and this is what I was afraid of when Ubisoft had announced it out loud, this creates kind of like an excuse for a lot of these companies to use. And I'm not saying it's not true, but as of right now, we know that maybe 2 games on the Nintendo Switch 2 actually required it. But obviously, we know that significantly more than 2 games that have released on the Nintendo Switch 2 actually needed it. You know, Ubisoft hasn't released any more games for the Switch 2 yet, if I'm not mistaken. But does this imply that when they release their next Rabbids party game, they're going to be putting that on fully on cartridge? Just Dance? Because I highly doubt it. And I mean, look at Square Enix. They put the Dragon Quest games, Octopath Traveler 0, even Bravely Default in some regions, all on game key cards. So it's not like they're just going to throw their highest end games on there that need it for the writing speed. And at that point, if they're showing that they rather go for the cheaper option for the smaller games that don't necessarily require the internal Switch 2 SSD, why would I necessarily believe them that they need it for the higher end stuff? It just feels like a much more convenient excuse to use rather than an actual reason to use it. And that being said, don't get me wrong, I actually think there might be some validity to what they're saying, but what, 2 out of all of the Switch 2 games actually need it right now? It just seems like a very convenient cop-out to use in order to make sure you deliver your games on the cheapest media possible. And I think for me, that's the only thing that's bothering me from the third-party devs specifically, right? Because they're all corporations looking for the dollar at the end of the day. I just don't like that they're completely trying to sidestep the fact that they're doing this because it's more lucrative and trying to focus more on the loading speeds, whether it's to save their own face or because they don't want to throw shade at Nintendo. And specifically, they would throw shade at Nintendo because their cartridge is so expensive. Because ultimately, the fault does fall back on Nintendo. They simply could have done what they were doing in previous console generations, and nobody would have any eyes on this at all. If they just created the same cartridges, the same levels of memory on each one that they had in the prior generation, third-party devs could have bought the smaller ones if they needed to, and gotten the larger ones for the games that were larger, and then that way, some of them could have done what they did last gen, where they put part of the game on that specific cartridge and required you to download the rest of it off the store. It's not ideal, and not many people like that practice, but at the very least, they could have hidden it a little better. Or they could have reserved game key cards specifically for games that were way too large and required it, either because they were super high-performing games and needed to be installed on the internal SSD, or because it was just too much memory and it wouldn't fit on a 64GB cartridge. Because for a lot of these games, a default 8 or 16GB cartridge would be more than enough. But instead, they're obviously going to pick the cheaper option, because why wouldn't they? The first-party titles sell much better on the Nintendo Switch. So now they get to create a larger retail presence for cheaper without worrying about the fact that most of their games are going to end up in the bargain bin eventually. But the problem is everything has just become too complicated now, and it's really kind of creating a dark cloud over the Nintendo Switch 2 in general. I kind of covered this in my Sonic Racing Crossworlds video already, but initially when Sonic Racing Crossworlds was going to be coming to the Switch 2, it was rumored to be on a game key card. And then all of a sudden the game was delayed and it was noticed that it was going to be fully on physical cart. So Sega obviously is like, yeah, we don't want to risk this. But they've delayed the physical release of the Nintendo Switch 2 version until later on in 2026. So basically, you have the digital version coming out near the holiday of 2025, and the physical version not coming out until 2026. But if you buy the game on your Nintendo Switch 1, you're going to be offered an upgrade path to get the Switch 2 version by simply keeping the Switch 1 cartridge. So now, unless you're willing to wait for 2026, which obviously a lot of people will be willing to wait for 2026, but anybody that wants to play the game on the Nintendo Switch 2 earlier than that, their options are either to buy it digitally or to buy the Switch 1 version and use the upgrade for that one. Both options do not require the Switch 2 cartridge, which is the most expensive one, which is the only option that's delayed until the following year. So it seems like the folks over at Sonic Team were like, let's make the most expensive version of this sale for us the latest version available. They'll make most of their money on all of the cross-platforms that are available, including the Switch, PS5, Steam, Xbox, and then they'll make most of their Switch 2 money either by people upgrading that Switch 1 version, or obviously downloading it digitally. And then at the very end, everybody that's left over that really wants this game can buy the physical copy on the Nintendo Switch 2. And you can't pretend this is not intentional. I mean, if you use Platonic Games as an example, they're releasing their digital titles at $20 cheaper than the physical one for Yooka-Laylee Replaylee. And it's obviously because of the additional cost that comes with having a physical title. And it seems pretty evident right now that the most expensive of all of the physical titles that are available in the gaming world is the Nintendo Switch 2 cartridge. So now every single excuse and every single marketing maneuver will have to come into play here in order to justify to the buyers of the Nintendo Switch 2 games that game keycards are going to need to be implemented for one reason or another. Because the reality is companies do not want to take a punt on this console, number one with the very expensive cartridge, and number two because it's a console and it's an atmosphere and an environment that historically performs drastically better from the first party angle than it does with the third parties. Especially, obviously, in comparison to the PlayStation 5, where they can just throw their games on there and know that they're completely sitting in a very comfortable atmosphere where third-party sales thrive and digital sales thrive, so it's just more money for them all around. And Nintendo's solution in order to try to take some of that market away from Sony was the game keycards. And the game keycards work very well for Nintendo, they work very well for the third-party developers, but they do not work very well for the people that matter the most, the customers. And that's specifically the customers that want a physical copy of a game so they can have the full game on the actual physical device. This should not be this complicated. It has been standard amongst the gaming industry through my entire life. And specifically, it's been standard in the Nintendo world. And Nintendo knows that. That's why they put all of their games fully on the cartridge. No game keycard BS. Like, they even put their firmware updates on the cartridges because they know that their audience sometimes does not connect to the internet, doesn't want to download stuff, and they want to be able to just put their cartridge in their console and be able to play. And obviously, like many people will point out, Nintendo is able to fit all of these games onto this cartridge and they're able to run fairly well. Why can't third-party developers do it? And you're absolutely correct. Third-party developers should be able to do it. So what is the big difference between what Nintendo does versus the other companies? It's obviously the cost. These are Nintendo's cartridges. They do not have to pay the additional 15 to 20 bucks in order to put their games on there. And Nintendo obviously knows this. They're not idiots. By making a single 64 gigabyte cartridge available without having smaller ones there, and likewise by making that single cartridge very expensive for third-party developers to even have to debate whether or not it's worth putting their games on there, they are more or less incentivizing third-party developers to put their games on game keycards. It is almost as if Nintendo wants third-party developers to use the game keycards instead of using the full-on cartridges. And whether this is for anti-piracy purposes, which I think is probably the biggest reason they do it. You can't dump a ROM off of a cartridge if there's no data on that cartridge. Or whether they do it because even for Nintendo, the cost of making the game keycards is cheaper anyway. Or maybe they just want to make sure their eShop is getting a whole lot of attention and a whole lot of downloads, because when you insert those cartridges in there, you have to go into the Nintendo eShop to make a download, and that looks good for their financials or something. It could be a number of reasons. It could be all of them put together. But whatever the case is here is that the fault is on Nintendo. They've created this. They've put every single third-party company in a very difficult position, and they've seemingly done a very good job trying to shift the blame away from themselves, forcing people to go after and harass third-party developers online and telling them, hey, pay more, put this on the cartridge, whereas the third-party devs are like, why would I take that gamble? That is just way too expensive of a risk for us, for a user base that's probably not going to be satisfying the sales targets that we have. And look, the point is for me is I don't buy into the narrative that the games need to be on the Switch 2 specifically because of the faster load times. Like, I think that's going to be for such a small percentage of the largest of third-party titles that it's going to be almost negligible. And even if that were the case, the Nintendo Switch 2 has a 256 gigabyte internal storage. And the only option to expand that storage is a proprietary SD card that is like super expensive. It's not even like a regular SD card. So you're adding like almost $100 of cost minimum onto your console if you want to keep your games on there and not have to keep re-downloading 90 gigabytes of data off of the eShop every now and then because there's a massive game that's too fast to be put on a 64 gigabyte cartridge that needs to be on your console. This whole mess takes away the entirety of the simplicity of a Nintendo console. And that simplistic nature of the Nintendo console has always been one of the best features. That's why this console appeals to the masses so much more than the other ones. That's why grandmas and grandpas buy it for their young little kids, so they don't have to access the internet. They don't have to keep re-downloading this and installing that. It's a large portion of the user base, and this just creates a convoluted mess now. And it's on Nintendo to find a solution. And they can risk it if they like. Keep the game key cards as the option available and only a 64 gigabyte counter option. But that's just going to result in fewer third-party sales, and that means most of these third-party companies will eventually shift away and not add more games onto the Nintendo Switch 2. But then again, if they decide to go another route, all of a sudden, maybe the third-party titles will be like, this is too expensive, we don't want to add anything onto Nintendo Switch 2 ecosystem because your cartridge just costs too much. And the worst part is, no matter which decision is made, either on Nintendo's end or on the third party's end, this is all going to rely on the environment of Nintendo fans who normally stick to first-party games to actually buy into more third-party titles. Either way, this looks exhausting. I don't know who at Nintendo thought the game key card option would be a good idea. I think it created a lot of unnecessary attention and a lot of unnecessary communication between the masses and the actual developers. It seems like they were trying to find a happy medium solution that would make everybody satisfied, but at the end of the day, it looks like it just upset everybody and gave a lot of attention to something that historically has not had that much attention. We'll obviously have to wait and see how this plays off in the long run. But there has already been a lot of controversy when it comes to third-party developers, whether the sales for the games early on were just not up to standard for what they expected, whether it's the shareholders themselves complaining to Furukawa about the game keycards, or rather expressing their concern, or even more recently, a Bloomberg article talking about some of this stuff. There's just a lot of bad light being shed onto this. And actually, I'm going to close off this whole segment with one thing that I just found out right now at the very end while editing. This is from an interview today, September 25th. In an interview with the folks over at Capcom, they're discussing Resident Evil 9. RE9 is obviously going to be one of the largest games on the Nintendo Switch 2 when it comes out. Probably one of the most graphically intense games on the console. And I kind of wish I saw this earlier on in my editing, because I just would have put this at the beginning of the video and it would have saved me about 10 minutes of talking. The question goes, one of the big topics at the moment around the Switch 2 are game keycards. As a team making one of the most technically intense Switch 2 games so far, is data streaming an issue when you're putting a game onto the card, as some other developers have suggested? Basically, are game keycards a developer consideration or a publishing one? And the reply is very simple and very straightforward, and I think backs up pretty much everything that I've said up until now. It is not a development decision for us, it's more of a sales strategy decision. Man, that is just the perfect reply, and just actively wraps up everything that I've talked about on this video so far. Just like everything in this gaming industry, everything in this world perhaps. It's all about the money. Honey.